All right, welcome back to part two of our thermoregulation lab, where uh, in this section we will primarily focus on how the body exchanges heat during exercise and specifically how exercise intensity and the surrounding environment influence the methods we rely on to stay cool. And so, first of all, we'll take a look at how exercise intensity increases, and with it, we have an increase in core body temperature. So, anytime we increase muscular work, we increase metabolic heat production. And this is, again, because we are very inefficient, right? So, only about 20-30% of the energy used for contraction goes towards actually performing work. About 70-80% ends up as heat. And during constant load, submaximal exercise in a cool or moderate environment, we see that this heat is carried away from the muscles via the uh, venous system and distributed throughout the body or the core, and thus increasing the core body temperature. Now, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus senses the rise in temperature and triggers sweating and increased skin blood flow. Eventually, the body will reach a new steady state core temperature. Now, this isn't a set point shift like you might see with a fever, right? We only have this new steady state core temperature while we exercise. Once we stop exercising, we see that we will have a gradual return back to our regular or constant core temperature at rest. So the preoptic anterior hypothalamus is still trying to bring the temperature back down during this point. It's just physiologically impossible to fully counteract that ongoing heat production during sustained exercise. Now, with the increasing intensity of exercise, we see heat production rises linearly. We also see core temperature rises linearly. And we become increasingly reliant on evaporative heat loss, which you can see in the first image or the first chart. Now, what you can see on the third chart or image is that energy output, heat production, and total heat loss all increase with work rate, whereas convective and radiative heat loss do not increase. And this is because the temperature gradient between the skin and the environment is going to stay relatively constant. And so evaporation is what rises steadily. Now, you probably can't tell because my bubble's in the way right now, but if you take a look at the PDF, you can view the chart a little more clearly. It's also in your textbook and your assigned readings. Now, the second point we will look at is how the temperature of our environment can significantly impact our heat exchange. So, looking at picture 2 or graph 2 just above me, we see that this is going to compare different environmental temperatures at the same exercise intensity and humidity. So the only thing really changing is temperature. And so exercise heat production is constant regardless of ambient temperature, but the ability to lose heat changes dramatically. So convective and radiative heat loss decrease because the temperature gradient between the skin and the air gets smaller, right? So if it's 98 degrees outside, that's much closer to our body temperature than if it's 40 degrees outside. And then we see evaporative heat loss increases to compensate and allow core body temperatures to remain stable. And we see this occurs at a crossover point, which is going to be at approximately 20 degrees Celsius. So above 20 degrees Celsius, evaporation becomes the dominant and eventually the only method of heat loss. And once ambient temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius, which is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the environment is actually hotter than the skin, which means you can't lose heat via your convection or radiation modes of heat transfer. You can now only gain heat from the environment because it's hotter and your body is cooler. So evaporation is the only cooling mechanism that's left at this high temperature. And this is why dry heat is survivable as long as you have enough water, but your hot, humid conditions are actually more dangerous because humidity reduces the vapor pressure gradient, which slows evaporation, which means we're slowing the rate at which we are able to lose heat. And we already established in those hot environments where it's 95 to 100 degrees like Louisiana and the humidity side, the only way we can lose heat is through evaporation. Now, when we look at sweat glands, since we've been talking about evaporation, we see that these are going to be the key mechanism during exercise as far as cooling the body. So humans dissipate heat primarily through sweating, and this is going to be controlled by the nervous system or innervated, and there are three key sweat gland types. So you have eccrine sweat glands, which are the most important when we are talking about transferring heat to our environment. They are the most abundant and they are found across the entire skin surface. So they are the primary contributor to evaporative cooling. Then you have apocrine glands, which attach to hair follicles. They are much less effective for cooling. And then you have your apocrine glands, which are found in limited areas like the scalp, for instance. And they have, as the name might indicate, an intermediate role between the apocrine and eccrine sweat glands as far as sweat production goes. But so with rising temperature, the preoptic anterior hypothalamus increases sympathetic stimulation of eccrine glands. The sweat rate increases proportionally to thermal stress, and we also see that anticipatory sweating can occur in trained athletes, and this is where the sympathetic nervous system activates eccrine glands before the core temperature even rises. So you are essentially sweating just because you are thinking about how hot it's going to be, or you know you're getting ready to exercise, so we're going to already try to start to cool you off. So sweat rates are influenced by a variety of factors. One, heat acclimation. So if you are more familiar, if you go outside in the summer and it's 95 with 80% humidity and you become acclimated to that environment, we actually see that you will sweat before someone who is not acclimated to that environment. So if you take a landscaper who's working outside from say 8 to 6 o'clock, and then you have an office worker who only works inside in the comfortable 70-degree temperature in the office, we see that that landscaper will actually sweat faster or earlier once exposed to a hot environment because we are trying to cool ourselves as soon as possible. And we also see that the landscaper will have a higher sweat rate as well. Now, genetics also is going to play a key role. You know, some people that just walk outside and immediately start sweating bullets, and then you have an individual who could go for a light jog in the same climate and appear to never sweat. And then body size is also going to be a factor that influences sweat rate. So we see larger individuals are generally going to sweat more than smaller individuals. Now, it is important to note that when we control for things like body mass and surface area, men don't actually sweat more than women. Yes, men do sweat more than women, but it's actually due to the other factors that we discussed, not gender itself, right? So when you actually account for the fact that men are larger, the fact that men have greater heat production whenever they, or a greater amount of heat production whenever they perform exercise, the surface area, so how much skin is actually exposed to the environment, we actually don't see any difference between men and women as far as their sweat rates go. Now, clothing actually matters a lot. So anything that blocks evaporation is going to trap heat. So, for example, a football player who's in full gear, pads, helmet, everything, we're going to see a significant increase in sweat rate, right, or drip rate, I should say, because we're blocking a lot of the evaporation. Whereas you could have a cross-country runner in a tank top and short shorts and has much more skin exposed to the environment that would allow for a greater evaporation. And then we also see around 180 to 240 pounds, an individual may sweat approximately 4 to 5 liters per hour in a very hot, humid environment. But specifically looking at football players, we see that two-a-days could lead to as much as 9 to 12 liters per day as far as sweat loss. And this significantly increases the risk of dehydration and heat injury. So just to recap, we see radiation and convection actually play very small but constant roles as long as the ambient air temperature isn't too high. But evaporation dominates the heat loss market during exercise. And in low humidity environments, evaporation is going to be extremely effective, regardless if it's cooler or hotter. It's going to be effective as long as we are in a relatively dry climate with low humidity. In high humidity, we see that the effectiveness of evaporation plummets, which again isn't great if you are exercising, because if we are in a very hot, humid environment, evaporation pretty much becomes our main or only source or mode to lose heat. And so this is why people out west are less likely to suffer from a heat-related illness than someone in the East, as far as the United States goes. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have to worry about heat-related illnesses. You absolutely do out west, particularly in like Arizona or California, even Montana, Montana, whenever it's the summertime, and particularly whenever you haven't adapted to the heat because it's freezing for most of the year. It is still important to make sure that individuals aren't suffering from heat-related illnesses and staying hydrated. But chances are, as long as you are staying hydrated, you are going to be much safer or much less likely to develop a heat-related illness compared to your people in Louisiana. But it is important to make sure that you stay hydrated. People in Louisiana know they're losing a lot of sweat because they are covered in it. It looks like they just took a shower with clothes on. Out west, like Arizona, for instance, you're going to see that sweat evaporates so quickly, you don't really notice you're even sweating. And you could actually just notice because there's like a light white dusting, almost like you're ashy from the electrolytes left from the sweat and whenever the water evaporated. So it's still very important to take the hot, dry environment seriously and making sure that you are getting the appropriate amount of water. And so carrying on from the hot, humid environment conversation, we are going to look at how dangerous the combination of heat and humidity becomes whenever it can significantly inhibit thermoregulation. So first thing we will take a look at is the heat index. So the heat index is basically the body's perception of how hot it feels, not just the temperature on the thermometer, but it combines the air temperature with relative humidity, because humidity dramatically affects how well your body can lose heat, because particularly when exercising, that's your only way to lose heat in climates that are 95 degrees and above. So, for example, if the air temperature is 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but the relative humidity is 80, what we see is that the heat index jumps to approximately 89 degrees Fahrenheit. So even though the temperature hasn't changed, the body experiences the environment differently and assumes that it is significantly hotter. And again, this is because humidity reduces our ability to evaporate sweat. So remember evaporation, our primary heat loss method during exercise. When the air is saturated with water vapor, sweat doesn't evaporate as efficiently. And if it can't evaporate, it can't carry heat away from the body. So heat loss drops and internal temperature ends up rising. Now, when we shift into exercise in hot temperatures, things become more challenging than your cool to moderate climate. So exercise already produces a huge amount of heat from muscle contraction, and in a hot environment, the body's normal cooling pathways, primarily evaporation, start to fail. And so as far as what we see physiologically, we see core temperature rises more quickly. So the thermal gradient between your skin and the environment maybe gets smaller, so you can't dump heat effectively. You're also going to see heart rate increases. And remember, we rely very heavily on blood flow to the skin to cool ourselves. And so, in the heat, the body needs to send blood to both the working muscles when we're exercising and the skin. And the cardiovascular system struggles to meet both demands. And so, heart rate ramps up in order to compensate. So, if you work in a hot, humid environment, you may actually see that your heart rate is higher than it typically would be if you worked in if you had trained in a cool, moderate environment. Now, we also have a higher risk of hyperthermia and heat injury as well. So, once core temperature pushes too high, the body's going to be in danger of heat exhaustion, stroke, which could eventually lead to a collapse. Now, we also see sweat rate increases as well. So, some athletes, like I said, can hit 4 to 5 liters per hour in your hot, humid conditions, and that's where dehydration really becomes a problem. So if they don't replace those fluids, we see plasma volume drops. If plasma volume drops, we see cardiac output is going to decrease, and thermoregulation becomes even worse or even less efficient. And so if you look at the graphs on the right, which again I'm kind of covering up half of, you can see this occur visually. So in hot, humid conditions, sweat rate climbs dramatically compared to your cool environment, and core temperature rises faster and reaches a higher level even at the same exercise intensity if you were in a cool environment. So overall, exercising in hot, humid conditions results in reduced ability to lose heat, leads to higher internal temperatures, higher cardiovascular strain, higher sweat rates, and increased risk of dehydration and heat illness. And so, carrying on from the dehydration issue, we'll take a look at some guidelines that will help limit dehydration and ensure the individual maintains their health as well as performance, because we see that dehydration is actually a main challenge in maintaining performance as well. So the first point we see that we'll talk about is that dehydration can result in impaired exercise performance if you lose just 1 to 2% of your body weight in fluid, which isn't that much, right? So if you look at a 150-pound person, that's just 1.5 to 3 pounds of fluid. Now, athletes can lose that in under an hour in a hot, humid environment. And once you cross that threshold of about 2%, you see symptoms like decreased blood volume, reduced ability to cool yourself, higher heart rate, higher perceived exertion, and faster onset of fatigue. And so the charts on the left, it's a little small on here, but you can blow it up on the PDF, are going to show common dehydration signs for adults as well as kids. And this is going to include anything from feeling tired and dizzy to dark urine and a rapid pulse. Now, looking at hydration guidelines, because preventing dehydration is always easier than fixing it mid workout, right? We see our guidelines are going to include a set of instructions for pre-exercise or pre-activity, what to do during exercise, and then immediately after exercise as well. So for our pre-activity guidelines, we see athletes should come into activity already hydrated. And that doesn't mean just guzzling a gallon of water right before your practice because you hadn't had anything to drink other than caffeine and alcohol the night before. That means drinking adequate fluids daily for several days leading into an event. On the day of exercise, this is a guideline more towards individuals who maybe are getting ready to perform a race. But on the day of exercise, they should consume somewhere between 400 to 800 milliliters of fluid, whether that be water or sports drink, in the 3 hours before the activity. And you really want to stop any fluid consumption half hour before that activity. So you have a 2.5 hour window. And that's just going to top off your plasma volume and give the sweating system a head start. And then during exercise, we see that fluid intake should continue throughout the event. Anywhere from 150 to 300 milliliters every 15-20 minutes is a general recommendation. For adults, it's going to vary more. Generally, you would have a more individualized approach. Kids, you're looking at 5 ounces of fluid every 20 minutes. Teenagers, you're looking at 8 to 9 ounces of fluid every 20 minutes. And that range adjusts based off of the heat and humidity levels, the body size of the individual, and the sweat rate. So again, that's why with adults we focus on a more individualized plan. Kids running around being active, the general guideline is going to remain the same before they fully develop. Now, again, this isn't just about guzzling water, and in fact, you shouldn't guzzle any water during exercise. It's about keeping pace with your losses so that core temperature isn't going to be compromised. So just taking small sips throughout the event instead of just downing, say, 8 ounces in a split second and then going back to exercising. Now, after exercise, this is actually where we see a lot of individuals fail to hydrate properly. So they drink until they're not thirsty, but thirst is often a late signal. So post-exercise, the goal should be to replace 150% of fluid loss. So for every 1 kilogram of body weight lost, you should consume roughly 1.5 liters of fluid. So if you're like, that makes no sense to me because I live in America and no idea what a kilogram or liter is, simple conversion, about 16 ounces of water fluid, sports drink, per pound of weight lost. Now, one of the easiest ways to know if you're recovering properly is to monitor your urine color. So pale yellow is going to be good. You are fully hydrated. If it's dark, you are severely dehydrated still, and you need to continue consuming fluid or sports drink, or increase your consumption throughout the day. Now, you don't want it to be perfectly clear either. You would be over hydrated then. Now, for most athletes, again, particularly in hot, humid conditions, some sport drinks are going to be superior to water for rehydration. So this is mainly because they replace sodium and carbohydrates, which help with absorption and maintaining your plasma volume. So yes, sports drinks are bad if you are just consuming them regularly, like juice. But when you are exercising or in a hot, humid environment, it actually is better to rehydrate utilizing a sports drink as opposed to just regular water. Now, some other guidelines you would want to follow. You want to exercise during the coolest part of the day if you live in a hot, humid environment. So early in the morning or late evening, very late evening. It's a kind of a trade-off. Early morning temperature won't be as high, but generally humidity is going to be at the highest level. Later evening temperature is going to be higher, but humidity is generally going to be lower. You also want to potentially reduce the intensity or duration if you are exercising during extreme heat and humidity. You want to also make sure that you expose as much surface area of skin as practical, right? Can't just be running around Miami nude, right? We still have to have shorts on, t-shirt, potentially something. So from a practical standpoint, we still have to obviously wear clothes, but we want to maximize how much of our skin is exposed to the air. We also want to make sure that we provide or build in frequent rest breaks and remove any equipment during these breaks. This is primarily for sports like lacrosse or football, for instance, where you're going to be covered in a significant amount of gear. And then we also want to ensure that rest areas are going to be shaded and provide moving air as well. And this will help with cooling or maintaining our core body temperature. And now we'll take a look at why exactly, or more specifically, performance drops off so dramatically in the heat. So we can group the causes into three major contributors, and they all interact with each other. So you have accelerated muscle fatigue, cardiovascular dysfunction, and central nervous system dysfunction. And again, none of these are going to work alone. They actually tend to stack on top of each other and work synergistically. So first of all, you have accelerated muscle fatigue, and we see in the heat, muscles fatigue faster for several reasons. One, muscle glycogen is going to be broken down more rapidly, so athletes run out of fuel sooner. Two, you have muscle lactate levels rise more quickly, which pushes muscle towards acidosis and contributes to that heavy burning sensation. Well, hold on, it's not lactate, it's the hydrogen ions, but lactate correlates with this. And then three, the production of free radicals will increase. So remember, free radicals are unstable molecules formed during muscle contraction, and when their levels increase, they damage contractile proteins and other cell structures. Now, all of these signals activate type 3 and 4 afferent nerve fibers. And this is going to send strong chemical feedback to the brain. And that feedback actually contributes to central fatigue, where the brain gets the message that the muscle is in distress and begins pulling back. And so muscle fatigue doesn't just stay in the muscle, it also loops back into the brain as an inhibitory signal. Now, you also have cardiovascular dysfunction. So the cardiovascular system is also stressed more heavily in the heat. We see that stroke volume decreases, which means the heart's pumping less blood per beat. And to compensate for that, heart rate will increase. But even with that compensation, we still see at higher exercise intensities, cardiac output can still fall. And this is because as stroke volume decreases, heart rate can only increase so much until you're at max heart rate. And if stroke volume is continuing to decrease or staying the same, you're going to have a lower cardiac output than what you would have in a cool, moderate environment when you were exercising. And what we see is a decrease of blood flow to the working muscles because there's a competition for blood flow. So you have your working muscles that need oxygen and other nutrients, but the skin also needs blood to help cool the body. And so as more blood is diverted to the skin to dissipate heat, muscle blood flow ends up decreasing. And then you have your central nervous system dysfunction. So that's going to be the third major factor. As core temperature rises, we see the brain begins to downregulate performance to protect the body. And this is a survival mechanism. Now, hypothermia will reduce mental drive as well as motivation and the ability to maintain voluntary effort. And again, your type 3, 4 afferents send strong distress signals back to the brain from the overheated muscle, which adds to an even more inhibitory feedback. And so this combination reduces central motor drive, meaning the brain recruits fewer motor units, even if the athlete is trying to push harder. So effort feels higher, output falls, and maintaining the pace becomes more difficult. So to put that all together, you have your accelerated muscle fatigue, cardiovascular strain, and central nervous system dysfunction or inhibition that all combine to impair performance in hot environments. And the relative contribution of each depends on the intensity and duration of the exercise, but we know that all three are always going to play a role. Now, we've been talking about heat-related illnesses, but we'll get a little more specific and look at the three main heat-related illnesses. And essentially, it's a progression of what happens when the body can't keep up with thermal stress. So the mildest form of heat-related illness would be heat cramps. So these are involuntary muscle cramps or spasms that usually show up when fluid and electrolytes are lower. And the key mechanism is reduced blood flow to the working muscles combined with dehydration, or partly because of dehydration. And so the muscle becomes more excitable, more prone to cramping, and the athlete, as a result, may feel sharp, painful spasm, which usually occurs in the legs, potentially the abdomen. And then you have your heat exhaustion, which kind of sits in the middle as far as the severity spectrum, but it is much more dangerous, I would say, than heat cramps. This typically occurs when dehydration has become significant and the body can no longer cool itself effectively. And the thermoregulation system is still trying, it's still fighting the good fight, but it's falling behind. And generally, here we'll see profuse sweating, we will see fatigue starting to set in. You could have nausea, headaches, dizziness, low blood pressure, maybe a rapid pulse. And with heat exhaustion, you'll see the individual has a pale complexion and very cool skin. So they'll be very sweaty, pale, and actually cool to the touch because their system is failing. And then you have heat stroke, which is the most severe form and is a true medical emergency at this point. So here we have heat regulation that has failed completely. It's over. We lost the fight. And core temperature is going to spike quickly, and usually we'll see above 104 degrees Fahrenheit if we measured the individual's temperature. And sweating will probably stop altogether. So here we see that the skin actually becomes very hot to the touch, very dry, with no sweat at all. And we definitely see confusion set in, potentially a loss of consciousness as well. And at this point, we need immediate cooling to take place. So the goal is rapid temperature reduction. Cold water immersion is the best way to go about this if possible. Ice packs on the armpits and groins also a good way. We want to make sure we're removing them from the climate as possible, if possible. So if we're way out in the middle of nowhere and we can't get them inside, maybe, or they lost consciousness and we can't move them, we would maybe look for some way to create shade, right? Maybe there's a tree that we can sit under as we try to cool the individual, or if we could, we would like to move them inside, have that cold water immersion if possible. And we actually don't want to hydrate these individuals immediately. So heat exhaustion, yes, get fluids to them. Stat, heat stroke, we actually don't want them to be drinking fluids in the practical setting. We'll see that they'll eventually have an IV that is set up, but the primary concern is actually that cold water immersion or ice packs in order to reduce temperature. The fluid we'll see at that extreme case could actually potentially have detrimental effects. Now, shifting to the opposite side of environmental extremes, we'll take a look at exercising in cold environments. So cold stress just means any environmental condition that starts to pull our core body temperature downward. And threatens our constant body temperature. And when the drop is large, we're looking at about 3 degrees Celsius or more, we may classify this as hypothermia. And there's multiple levels of hypothermia. You have mild, moderate, and severe. And during exercise in the cold, we actually are going to have advanced or enhanced heat loss, which is going to reduce the risk of heat-related injury, which is good, but it increases the risk in the opposite direction where we potentially cool too far, too fast, resulting in potentially hypothermia instead of hyperthermia. Hyperthermia, we are too hot. Hypothermia, we are cooling off too quickly. Now, whether or not someone becomes hypothermic depends on several factors. You have your clothing choices. So we definitely want to have layers, and at least one of those layers be wind resistant whenever we're dealing with extreme cold temperatures. Also, the individual's metabolic heat production, meaning how hard the individual is working, right? So if I'm just standing or laying down doing snow angels, not working very hard, as opposed to maybe going for a long run or doing sprints out on the football field if there's no snow. We would be producing a lot more heat in those events than me just laying down and doing some snow angels. Also, subcutaneous fat will play a role as well, because this will act as an insulator. So the more fat you have on you, the better insulated you are. So there's a pro to that, and you definitely want it in cold environments. And then also your surface to mass ratio. So again, a smaller individual with more surface area relative to body mass may lose heat faster. Muscle mass also contributes to heat production when active. So individuals with more muscle mass will be able to generate more heat and maintain their core body temperature. Also, surface to mass ratio will be affected by, say, body composition. So looking at a very lean individual, they may actually have less of a surface to mass ratio than a larger individual who has a significant amount of fat on them. Now, in most land-based exercise, the combination of clothing and metabolic heat production is usually going to be enough to prevent hypothermia. The major exception is cold water immersion, right? So think about when you go outside and you start exercising, if the snow's not covered, you actually probably start sweating relatively soon, right? So, and you actually have to take maybe a layer off or take your hat off to make sure that you don't sweat. So in this case, we aren't really concerned with a drop in our body temperature, because we're actually trying to lose heat, or our body's like, hey, we're actually heating up from this activity. We need to lose heat. Water is the exception. So water conducts heat away from the body more effectively than just air, like 25 times more effectively. So swimming in cold water or being exposed to cold water can overwhelm our ability to maintain our core body temperature even during heavy exercise, like if you were swimming really fast, but you were dropped into near freezing or very cold water. So if you're going ice fishing and fell in, for instance. Now, from a performance standpoint, cold exposure creates two main problems. One, the hands are especially vulnerable. So we're going to see reduced blood flow and slower neurotransmission, which makes the hands numb. And that loss in dexterity, uh, dexterity, uh, dexterity, there we go, shows up uh, very quickly in fine motor tasks. So think about how quickly you aren't even able to, say, tie your shoes if you forgot your gloves, or you had to take your gloves off, and then uh, your fingies immediately started freezing. And then also we see that the cold can impair both strength and power. So if muscle temperature drops significantly, like during cold water immersion, a drop of about 8 degrees Celsius can reduce strength and power by 31 to 44%. And we see in cold air, this usually doesn't happen because working muscles stay warm enough internally. So cold air rarely decreases force production. It's really only uh, uh, during cold water exposure. And then aerobic performance in the cold is less studied, and there are some mixed results, but it doesn't seem like strength and power are really going to be affected for aerobic performance as well. Now, when we look at some key, say, safety points, cold water exposure below 15 degrees Celsius uh, will generate a real hypothermia risk if we aren't able to pull that individual out, dry them off, and make sure they are in a warm environment. You also see that core temperatures dropping into the mid 20s Celsius range can trigger life-threatening arrhythmias. Uh, so what we see with severe hypothermia is that individuals will get very tired and actually want to lay down and stop moving, which is actually the opposite of what we want them to do, because we want them to keep moving and generating heat and trying to maintain their core body temperature. And in those severe cases where body temperature drops too much, you can see those life-threatening arrhythmias. You could see a coma or potentially death, or eventually death, arise. And then we also see cold air, again, far less dangerous for core temperature, but exposed skin can develop frostbite very quickly once air temperatures fall below freezing. Well, to experience frostbite, air temperature has to be below freezing, but once we are below freezing and you have a significant wind chill, so if you're at 0 and negative 30, we could see frostbite occur in a matter of minutes. So although cold air isn't necessarily a huge concern as far as reducing core body temperatures to a health risk point, we do see that cold air can still have detrimental effects to one's health, primarily any exposed skin. Now, it is important to note that breathing cold air doesn't freeze the lungs, right? So the air will be warmed and humidified before it ever reaches them, but it can trigger exercise-induced asthma in susceptible individuals because the airways do cool and dry rapidly. And in severe cases where you are performing high intensity exercise for a significant duration, like if you were getting, say, chased by a polar bear and you couldn't slow down, and you were breathing through your mouth, which reduces the amount of time that air is warmed and humidified, and if it's a very, very cool and dry environment, we could see some potential damage. But chances are that polar bear is gonna damage you before we would ever care about your lungs being damaged in any significant way. So overall, the cold can protect us against heat injury, but also brings about its own performance limitations, right? You might start shivering, which isn't great if you're trying to catch a ball, or if you're, say, in the military and you're trying to line up a shot. And so as a result, we would like to make sure that individuals are acclimated to their environment. And getting back to the fact that cold does protect us from heat injury, but it has performance limitations. We also have those physiological risks, depending on mainly the environment and the activity and how well we dressed and prepared for the weather. And then the last tidbit that we will discuss will be the adaptations and physiological responses to our environment, whether it be repeated exposure to heat or cold. Now, there's two main terms here. We have acclimatization, which is simply describing how the body adapts to repeated exposure, either to heat or to cold. And acclimatization happens over a longer period of time, usually weeks to months, and it's going to happen more naturally. And then you also have acclimation, which is more of the short-term adaptation that develops over a few days or weeks. And this is generally going to be maybe a little more synthetic. So, for example, maybe a football team tries to drop their indoor practice facility to 40 degrees because they have to go from Miami to Notre Dame to play in the college football playoffs, because they better both make the playoffs this year, or just Miami. And so as a result, we need to create an artificial environment that allows us to at least practice in these colder conditions and get used to that, so that when we travel up to South Bend, Indiana, it's 20 degrees when we're still used to 85 at this time of the year. Our football players are less likely to experience any adverse effects associated with extreme cold, like shivering and thus not being able to catch the ball or not being able to feel your fingers. So first of all, we will take a look at heat acclimation. So heat acclimation typically takes about 10 to 14 days of repeated heat exposure. Now, I did want to mention, that acclimatization and acclimation generally used interchangeably. For this purpose, we are primarily looking at acclimation, just the short turnaround on the adaptations that we could experience. So heat acclimation takes about 10-14 days. Some adaptations can occur even sooner. So, for example, we see that within about 2 to 5 days, plasma volume can increase by 10 to 12%. That increase helps maintain blood volume, stroke volume, and sweating capacity as the body heats up. And with repeated exposure, the body starts sweating earlier and produces more sweat, which helps reduce heat storage and lowers core temperature during exercise. So if you go outside and start to exercise and immediately are just drenched, soaked in your own sweat, congrats, you have acclimated to your environment. Or you just have genetics that make you sweat bullets. But if you became acclimated, you would sweat even more bullets. Now, we also see reduced sodium chloride loss in sweat, which is beneficial because it protects against electrolyte disturbances. And we also see reduced skin blood flow because the expanded plasma volume makes cooling more efficiently, which means now we have less competition with our working muscles who need the blood flow for oxygen delivery. Now, on the cellular side, we see that repeated heat exposure increases production of heat shock proteins, and these proteins will help stabilize and refold damaged proteins and generally protect cells from heat-related injury. Now, all of these adaptations allow the athlete to maintain homeostasis better under heat stress, but none of these adaptations are permanent. So heat tolerance begins to decline after just 7 days without that repeated heat exposure and is completely lost by about a month or 28 days. So if you say were acclimated to the heat and you were going outside running all day, you worked out worked outside all day in say July and August, and then September rolled around and you were in the office 24/7, you didn't get to really go outside at all, and then October rolls around and there's a heat wave and we're back in the 90s, you don't have the same physiological adaptations that you had in August whenever you had been out training and walking around, exploring, whatever you were doing, working outside, as you don't have the same physiological adaptations as you did in that time period because you spent a month inside at 70 degrees. You weren't ever exposed to any real excessive heat, and so we saw a reversal in those positive adaptations that you had gained in the summer. Now, for athletes training in cooler climates, people will sometimes try to mimic heat acclimation by wearing heavy or less breathable clothing during exercise. This does raise core temperature and it can provide some benefits, but it's nowhere near the same as true heat acclimation. It also increases sweat loss and thus increases the risk of heat injury, and any weight loss is just fluid loss, and there's no real change in body composition. So for instance, you see wrestlers might put a trash bag on over their or under their sweatshirt, in between sweatshirts, whenever they're trying to lose an immense amount of weight relatively quickly. For them and other like MMA weight division sports, that this is fine because we're just trying to meet a specific goal. But when you see individuals who are trying to reduce their fat, this has no real benefit to them because any weight loss that they get from wearing the extra sweatshirts or trash bags is just fluid loss. It's not any significant amount of additional fat that they burned. Uh, we also have passive heating approaches as far as heat acclimation goes. So, for instance, using things like saunas or trying to raise core temperature artificially can help, but again, there are still some safety concerns. As far as most of these techniques, you really only see them useful for, say, individuals who are just trying to make a specific weight. And this can still be dangerous for individuals who are just looking for overall health. They don't have any benefit as far as body composition goes. So I would steer clear from it if you aren't looking for specific performance improvements. Uh, so, for instance, like being able to catch a ball or shoot at very high or low temperatures. And then we also have cold acclimation, which actually happens, I don't want to say much faster, but significantly faster. Most adaptations actually occur within the first 7 days of repeated chronic cold exposure. And what we see is with acclimation, the body delays the onset of shivering because it relies more on non-shivering thermogenesis, mainly through catecholamine-driven heat production. And people also develop a better ability to maintain warmer hand and foot temperatures thanks to improved peripheral blood flow. And this will ensure that those individuals are less likely to suffer any cold-related injuries, such as frostbite. It may increase the amount of time that exposed skin will have before actually suffering from that injury. And we also see that many individuals who become acclimated to colder environments see that it becomes easier to sleep in cold conditions because the disruptive shivering response that you typically have is going to be reduced. And so increasing non shivering thermogenesis is very important for pretty much everyone because, one, we see that the shivering is going to reduce performance in skill related activities. We are going to see that you will eventually sleep better in these environments, which again is going to be very beneficial for your recovery from any sort of exercise that you are performing. And as a result, just the general population, but any athletes will most likely see beneficial effects from cold acclimation whenever it comes to performance. Your hands stay warmer longer, meaning you can feel your fingers a little longer, which is, again, good for skill related events. And then same with the military, having to make sure that you can feel your fingers, your toes, making sure that you can pull the trigger, making sure you're not shaking while you're holding the gun, making sure that you can get I don't say good night's rest, but maybe a good couple hours if you're trekking somewhere. So cold acclimation is very important, and we see a very quick turnaround on this. So technically, you would say it could potentially be easier for Indiana, no, excuse me, for Miami to get ready to play Indiana in South Bend than it would be for uh, Indiana or Notre Dame to get ready for Miami down in Miami if they were playing in the Orange Bowl. So you would only need, or Miami would only need maybe one full week where they try to dedicate uh, time to exposing players to cold, whereas the Indiana or Notre Dame teams would need almost 2 full weeks to see these significant improvements as they try to expose their players to warmer conditions to get them prepared for the environment that they would be playing in.